In Boston's Four Seasons ballroom, a bride in ivory silk was about to face her new family's cruelest moment. What started as a wedding speech took a shocking turn when Eleanor and Victoria Ashford openly mocked her words. Clarisse Evans wasn't your typical waitress. For 5 years, she had secretly built a real estate empire worth millions, known for her strategic brilliance and hidden identity. When she encountered their dismissive whispers during her heartfelt toast, she had no idea she was walking into her greatest opportunity for justice. Clarisse's investigation would lead to owning their mortgage. What began as wedding day humiliation would become total power reversal. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The crystal chandelier cast prismatic light across the reception hall of the Four Seasons Boston, illuminating faces that ranged from genuinely warm to coldly polite. Clarisse Evans, now Clarisse Ashford, stood at the microphone, her wedding dress a cascade of ivory silk that had cost more than most people made in 3 months. She'd bought it herself, of course, though no one here knew that. "I never imagined," she began, her voice steady despite the tremor in her chest, "that someone like me would find herself here today." A ripple of polite attention moved through the crowd. At the head table, James smiled at her with genuine love, his dark eyes warm with pride. But just beyond him, Clarisse caught the subtle exchange between his mother Eleanor and sister Victoria, a barely perceptible roll of Eleanor's eyes, followed by Victoria's thin-lipped smirk. "Growing up in foster care," Clarisse continued, "you learn early that family isn't about blood. It's about the people who choose to stand by you, who see your worth when the world tells you you're worthless." Eleanor Ashford's manicured fingers drummed once against the white tablecloth, a gesture so small most wouldn't notice. But Clarisse had learned to read the language of dismissal in all its forms. Victoria leaned toward her mother, whispering something behind her champagne flute that made Eleanor's lips twitch with suppressed amusement. The memory hit Clarisse like a physical blow. Sitting in her first foster home at age 7, watching the other kids get chosen while she remained invisible. The same feeling of inadequacy, of being fundamentally lacking, washed over her now. "When my parents died in that car accident, I thought I'd lost everything," she pressed on, her voice gaining strength. "But what I learned is that sometimes losing everything teaches you what truly matters." She caught sight of Marcus Williams near the back of the room, his server's uniform pristine as he moved between tables. Their eyes met briefly, and he gave her the smallest nod of encouragement. Marcus understood. He'd been there through her darkest moments and her greatest triumphs, though the latter remained hidden from everyone else in this room. "I worked 3 jobs to put myself through college," Clarisse said, the words carrying a weight that should have commanded respect. Instead, she watched Victoria mime yawning to Eleanor, who covered her mouth to hide a laugh. Heat rose in Clarisse's chest. These women, who had never worked a day in their lives, who had inherited their positions and their wealth, found her struggles amusing. James noticed the exchange, but merely shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his gaze dropping to his hands. "But the greatest gift wasn't my education," Clarisse continued, fighting to keep her voice level. "It was learning that strength comes from within, that your circumstances don't define your worth, and that sometimes the people who have the least to offer materially have the most to give emotionally." The barb was subtle, but intentional. She watched Eleanor's spine stiffen slightly, though the woman's smile never wavered. Victoria, however, was less subtle in her disdain, making an exaggerated expression of confusion to her tablemate, as if Clarisse's words were incomprehensible. "James," Clarisse's voice softened as she looked at her new husband, "you taught me that love doesn't care about bank accounts or pedigree. You saw me, really saw me, when I was just a waitress taking your order at Murphy's Diner." A flash of memory, the first property closing she'd ever attended 3 years ago. Sitting across from a seller who'd assumed she was someone's assistant until she'd produced the cashier's check for $400,000. The man's expression had shifted from condescension to shock to grudging respect in the span of seconds. She'd learned that day that power came not from titles or breeding, but from the ability to act when others merely talked. "To my new family," she raised her champagne glass, "thank you for welcoming me." The lie tasted bitter on her tongue. Eleanor and Victoria raised their glasses with the mechanical precision of people going through motions. Eleanor's smile was as cold as Boston Harbor in January, while Victoria's held a cruelty that made Clarisse's chest tighten. As the applause began, polite, measured, lacking any real warmth from half the room, Clarisse caught Grace Murphy's eye. The Ashford family's longtime housekeeper stood near the service entrance, her weathered face kind but knowing. Grace offered her a small, sympathetic smile that somehow hurt more than the cold stares. Grace knew. She'd seen this family's true nature up close for 20 years. "Thank you," Clarisse concluded, stepping back from the microphone to scattered applause. James rose to embrace her, his kiss on her cheek gentle and loving. "That was beautiful," he whispered, but she could feel the tension in his shoulders, see the way his eyes avoided looking toward his mother and sister. As the band began playing and conversations resumed, Clarisse made her way through the crowd, accepting congratulations that ranged from heartfelt to perfunctory. But Eleanor's voice, pitched just loud enough to carry, stopped her cold. "Well, that was earnest," Eleanor was saying to Mrs. Pemberton, a family friend. "I suppose we all have our stories of overcoming adversity, though some of us managed to do so with a bit more grace." Victoria's laugh was like breaking glass. "Mother, really. At least she didn't mention the time she had to share a bedroom with 3 other girls. I heard all about it from Cousin Margaret." "The important thing," Eleanor continued, her voice carrying the casual cruelty of someone accustomed to being overheard, "is that James is happy, even if this adjustment will take time for all of us." Clarisse felt something cold and sharp crystallize in her chest. The same feeling she'd had when Mr. Davidson, her high school guidance counselor, had suggested she consider more realistic career options than business school. The same feeling that had driven her to work 16-hour days and sleep on friends' couches to prove him wrong. She excused herself and walked toward the bridal suite, her steps measured and controlled, despite the fury building inside her. Behind her, she could hear the party continuing, the sound of her humiliation already fading into background noise. The bridal suite was a haven of cream silk and soft lighting, but Clarisse barely noticed the luxury. She stood before the mirror, seeing not a bride but a woman who had just been reminded of her place in the world. No matter what she achieved, no matter how successful she became, to people like Eleanor and Victoria, she would always be the foster kid who didn't belong. A soft knock interrupted her spiraling thoughts. "Come in," she called, expecting her wedding coordinator. Instead, Marcus slipped inside, his expression serious. "You okay?" The question broke something loose inside her. "Did you see them?" she asked, her voice tight with controlled rage. "Did you see their faces during my speech?" Marcus closed the door behind him and leaned against it. "I saw Eleanor and Victoria being exactly who they've always been. Cruel, entitled, and too stupid to recognize what they're dealing with." James just sat there, Clarisse whispered, the betrayal cutting deeper than his family's cruelty. "He saw them mocking me and he just sat there." "He's been trained his whole life to avoid confrontation with them," Marcus said gently. "Doesn't make it right, but—" "No," Clarisse interrupted, her voice gaining steel. "It doesn't make it right." She moved to the window, looking out at Boston's skyline. Somewhere out there were 12 properties she owned, worth a combined $8, $2 million. A portfolio she'd built deal by deal, acquisition by acquisition, while working double shifts and pretending to be nothing more than a waitress, with dreams too big for her station. "You know what the worst part is?" she said, not turning around. "They think they're better than me. Eleanor with her old money pretensions and Victoria with her failed marriage and complete lack of purpose. They look at me and see someone beneath them." Marcus joined her at the window. "They don't know who you really are." "No," Clarisse agreed, her reflection in the glass showing a woman on the edge of a crucial decision. "They don't. But maybe it's time they learned." A memory surfaced. Her first major acquisition, a 6-unit building in Somerville. The seller had been a pompous man in his 60s, who'd kept calling her honey, and suggesting she bring her husband to really discuss the numbers. She'd closed on the property that afternoon, paying cash through her shell company, Evans Capital Holdings. The man's shock when his lawyer explained who had bought his building had been satisfying. Clarisse. Marcus's voice carried a warning she'd heard before. Whatever you're thinking. I'm thinking, she said slowly, that I'm tired of hiding. Tired of pretending to be less than I am so other people feel comfortable. She turned from the window, and Marcus saw something in her expression that made him step back. It was the same look she'd worn the day she'd decided to buy her first property, the day she'd incorporated Evans Capital Holdings, the day she'd made every calculated move that had brought her to this moment. They want to treat me like I'm nothing, she said, her voice quiet but filled with a dangerous certainty. Maybe it's time they learned what nothing can become when it refuses to stay in its place. Outside the suite, the wedding reception continued, the sound of laughter and music filtering through the walls. But inside, Clarisse Evans Ashford stood at a crossroads, feeling the weight of secrets that could reshape everything. The woman who had built an empire in shadows was beginning to consider stepping into the light, not to be accepted, but to be reckoned with. The humiliation of tonight would not be forgotten. But perhaps, she thought as she straightened her wedding dress and prepared to return to the party, it didn't have to be endured in silence forever. The humiliation of tonight would not be forgotten. But perhaps, she thought as she straightened her wedding dress and prepared to return to the party, it didn't have to be endured in silence forever. 3 days later, the salt air of Martha's Vineyard should have been washing away the sting of the wedding reception. Instead, it seemed to amplify every unresolved tension between Clarisse and James as they sat on the deck of their oceanfront suite at the Charlotte Inn. "You're still thinking about Saturday night," James said, not looking up from his coffee and the Boston Globe spread across the wicker table. Clarisse watched a sailboat cut through the harbor waters, its white sail catching the morning sun. "Your mother called me earnest like it was a disease. She didn't mean anything by it." The words came out automatically, a practiced deflection that made Clarisse's jaw tighten. That's just her way. Her way. Clarisse turned to face him, noting how he still avoided her eyes. "James, your sister mimed falling asleep during my speech about growing up in foster care. Your mother laughed. And you think that's just their way?" He folded the newspaper with sharp, precise movements. "They're adjusting. This is all new for them." "Adjusting to what exactly? To the fact that you married someone who actually worked for a living?" "That's not." James started, then stopped, running his hand through his dark hair. "Look, can we not do this? We're on our honeymoon." The phrase hung between them like a wall. Clarisse felt something cold settle in her stomach. The same sensation she'd experienced when a property deal was about to fall apart. That moment when you realized the other party had never been negotiating in good faith. Her phone buzzed against the glass table. Marcus's name appeared on the screen. "I need to take this," she said, standing. "Who calls someone on their honeymoon?" James asked, but there was more irritation than curiosity in his voice. "Work emergency." The lie came easily now, polished by years of practice. She walked into the suite's bedroom, closing the door behind her. "Marcus, this better be important. The Meridian Street property just fell through." Marcus's voice crackled through the phone. Seller got cold feet about the environmental assessment. Clarisse sank onto the edge of the four-poster bed, her mind immediately shifting into business mode. The Meridian Street deal was worth $2. $3 million, a mixed-use building in Cambridge that would have been a cornerstone addition to her portfolio. "What's the real reason?" she asked. "Environmental issues don't just appear overnight." "Competition." Someone offered him 10% over asking. Cash, no contingencies. "Who?" "Still tracking that down. But here's the thing. I've got another lead. Remember that contact I have at First National? She mentioned something about the Ashford family account." Clarisse's attention sharpened. "What about it?" "Sounds like they've been having some interesting conversations with their mortgage department lately. Missed payments, extension requests. The kind of conversations that suggest money problems." Through the bedroom door, Clarisse could hear James on a call, his voice animated in a way it hadn't been with her all morning. "I'm on my honeymoon, Marcus. Can't this wait?" "Sure thing, boss. Just thought you'd want to know that old money isn't always liquid money. Enjoy the beach." After hanging up, Clarisse stared at her reflection in the antique mirror across the room. The woman looking back at her wore a silk sundress that cost more than most people's weekly salary. bought with money earned from deals that no one in her new family knew existed. She returned to the deck to find James just ending his call, his expression more relaxed than it had been since they'd arrived. "Everything okay?" she asked. "Just work stuff. One of our pro bono clients needed some advice." The irony wasn't lost on her. His work was acceptable to discuss. Hers had to be hidden behind lies about restaurant scheduling. They spent the afternoon at South Beach, James reading legal briefs while Clarisse pretended to enjoy a novel. But her mind kept circling back to Marcus's words about the Ashford family's financial situation. The pieces of information she'd gathered over the months of dating James began forming a different picture. The way Eleanor always insisted on dining at the most expensive restaurants but never seemed to actually pay. Victoria's complaints about her divorce settlement, which had apparently been less generous than expected. Robert Sr.'s increasing confusion about business matters, and Eleanor's quick interventions whenever he started discussing finances. That evening, they dined at the hotel's restaurant, the atmosphere elegant but somehow hollow. James made conversation about the wine, the view, anything except the tension that had been building between them since the wedding. It was during dessert that Clarisse heard the voice that made her blood run cold. "James Ashford, what a delightful surprise." Mrs. Catherine Pemberton approached their table with the predatory smile of someone who lived for social gossip. She'd been at the wedding, seated at Eleanor's table, close enough to witness every dismissive gesture. "Mrs. Pemberton?" James stood, his charm automatic. "How lovely to see you. This is my wife, Clarisse." "Of course, the bride." Mrs. Pemberton's smile was razor-thin as she looked at Clarisse. "Such an interesting speech you gave at the reception." "Thank you," Clarisse replied evenly. "I was just telling my husband about it this morning." So refreshing to hear from someone who's truly experienced hardship. Most of us simply can't imagine what it must be like to grow up without advantages. The word advantages dripped with condescension. Clarisse felt James tense beside her, but he remained silent. "Eleanor mentioned you work in food service?" Mrs. Pemberton continued. "How nice that James is supportive of your career aspirations." "I do various things," Clarisse said, her voice carefully neutral. "Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story." "How wonderfully flexible." Mrs. Pemberton's laugh was crystalline and sharp. "Well, I must dash. Eleanor and I are meeting tomorrow to discuss the hospital charity board. Such important work giving back to those less fortunate." After she left, James reached for his wine glass with slightly shaking hands. "I'm sorry about that. She's always been a reflection of your family's values," Clarisse finished. "That's not fair, isn't it?" Clarisse set down her spoon, her appetite completely gone. "James, when was the last time you actually defended me? When was the last time you told your mother that her comments about my background were inappropriate? Or your sister that her behavior was cruel? It's complicated." "No, it's not." Clarisse's voice carried the steel that Marcus had learned to recognize, the tone that meant she was done being accommodating. "It's simple. Either you believe I'm worth defending, or you don't." James stared at her, and in that moment she saw something that chilled her more than his family's cruelty: resignation. He'd accepted their treatment of her as the price of keeping peace. He'd chosen his family's comfort over her dignity. That night, as James slept beside her, Clarisse lay awake listening to the ocean waves and thinking about power. About the 12 properties in her portfolio. About the shell company that existed in legal documents, but nowhere in her husband's understanding of who she was. About the fact that Marcus's casual comment about the Ashford family's financial troubles might be the key to everything. She slipped out of bed and onto the suite's balcony, pulling up her secure banking app on her phone. The numbers glowed in the darkness. $8. $2 million in current assets, with credit lines that could take her to $12 million within 48 hours. Enough to buy influence, enough to buy respect. Enough to ensure that she would never again sit silently while someone treated her as less than human. The woman who had built an empire in shadows was beginning to consider stepping into the light, not to be accepted, but to be reckoned with. The humiliation of the wedding reception would not be forgotten, but perhaps it could be transformed into something far more powerful. As the waves crashed against the shore below, Clarisse began planning her next acquisition. This one would be personal. As the waves crashed against the shore below, Clarisse began planning her next acquisition. This one would be personal. The third-floor walk-up in South Boston looked like any other cramped apartment from the outside. But behind the false wall Clarisse had installed, her real office operated like a war room. Bank statements, property records, and financial reports covered every surface. She'd been back from Martha's Vineyard for 2 days, and the Ashford family's secrets were finally revealing themselves. Jesus Christ, Clarisse! Marcus stood in the doorway, holding a stack of documents. You need to see what I found at the Registry of Deeds. She looked up from her laptop, where 3 different databases painted a picture of systematic financial decline. Tell me. The mansion on Beacon Hill? It's not just mortgaged. Marcus spread the papers across her desk. It's leveraged to hell and back. Primary mortgage of $4. $2 million. Second mortgage for $800,000. And a home equity line of credit that's maxed out at $600,000. Clarisse studied the documents, her business mind calculating automatically. That's over $5 million in debt on a property assessed at $6. $8 million. They've got maybe $1 million in actual equity. Gets worse. Marcus pulled up a chair. I traced their payment history. They've missed 3 mortgage payments in the last 6 months. The bank's already started foreclosure proceedings. The information hit Clarisse like a physical blow. All of Eleanor's condescension, all of Victoria's cruel superiority, it was built on a foundation of debt and desperation. They were performing wealth they no longer possessed. There's more, Marcus continued, his voice grim. Remember that package of distressed mortgages we bought last quarter? The ones from Hancock Financial? Clarisse's fingers stilled on the keyboard. The $12 million portfolio? I ran the addresses against our acquisition records. Marcus slid another document across the desk. We already own the mortgage on their Nantucket property. Have for 3 months. The silence stretched between them as the implications sank in. Clarisse had been unknowingly collecting monthly payments from the family that had humiliated her at her own wedding. The irony was so sharp it cut. They don't know, she said finally. The payments come through their property management company. No reason they'd connect it to Evans Capital Holdings. Clarisse pulled up the Nantucket file on her screen. The summer house Victoria constantly posted about on social media, the one where the family gathered every August to maintain their facade of old money elegance. The mortgage was $1. $8 million, and like everything else in the Ashford portfolio, the payments were irregular. What are you thinking? Marcus asked, though his tone suggested he already knew. I'm thinking, Clarisse said slowly, that the primary mortgage on Beacon Hill is probably about to come up for sale. Banks don't like carrying bad debt, especially when the borrowers have proven unreliable. She was already calculating. With her current liquidity and credit lines, acquiring the Ashford Mansion's mortgage would be not just possible, but simple. 1 phone call, 1 wire transfer, and she would own the paper on the house where Eleanor held court like a queen. This isn't just about money anymore, Marcus said quietly. No, Clarisse agreed, her reflection staring back from the dark window. It's about respect. This isn't just about money anymore, Marcus said quietly. No, Clarisse agreed, her reflection staring back from the dark window. It's about respect. 2 days later, Clarisse sat across from Marcus at Mel's Diner, the same Formica table where they'd planned their first property acquisition 5 years ago. The lunch crowd buzzed around them. Construction workers and office assistants who had no idea they were sitting near a woman worth 8 figures. You're really going to do this, Marcus said, stirring his coffee with mechanical precision. It wasn't a question. I already put the call in to Hancock Financial. They're eager to unload the Ashford debt. Apparently, Eleanor's been calling them daily, begging for extensions. Clarisse cut into her turkey sandwich, though her appetite had vanished. The paperwork could be finalized by Friday. And then what? You foreclose on your husband's family home? The question hung between them like smoke. Clarisse had been asking herself the same thing for 48 hours, running scenarios that ranged from gentle pressure to complete destruction. I don't know, she admitted. I just know I can't keep living like this, pretending to be nothing while they treat me like I'm less than human. Marcus leaned forward, his voice dropping. Clarisse, listen to yourself. You're talking about using your financial power to hurt people. How does that make you different from them? Clarisse's laugh was sharp. Marcus, they've been using their social power to hurt me since the day James brought me home. The only difference is, their power is all smoke and mirrors. But it's still revenge. Before Clarisse could respond, a familiar voice cut through the diner's ambient noise. Clarisse? Is that you, dear? Both of them turned to see Grace Murphy approaching their table, her arms full of grocery bags from the market next door. The Ashford housekeeper looked older than her 65 years, worry lines etched deep around her eyes. Grace, Clarisse stood, genuinely surprised. What brings you to this neighborhood? My sister lives around the corner. I pick up her groceries once a week. Grace's gaze shifted to Marcus, then back to Clarisse. Mind if I sit for a moment? These bags are heavier than they used to be. Marcus immediately stood to help with the groceries, and Grace settled into the booth with a grateful sigh. You look tired, honey, she said to Clarisse. Marriage treating you well? The innocent question hit like a punch. Clarisse found herself studying Grace's lined face, seeing genuine concern there. Of everyone in the Ashford orbit, Grace had been the only one to show her consistent kindness. It's an adjustment, Clarisse said carefully. Grace's knowing look suggested she understood more than she was saying. 20 years I've worked for that family. I've seen a lot of adjustments. Grace, Marcus interjected gently. Clarisse was just telling me about some of the challenges with James's family. Ah! Grace's expression hardened slightly. Eleanor and Victoria, you mean? The confirmation that Grace saw the family's behavior clearly gave Clarisse an unexpected surge of validation. They don't exactly roll out the welcome mat. No, they don't. Grace glanced around the busy diner, then leaned closer. Honey, can I speak plainly? Clarisse nodded. That family is hanging by a thread. Has been for 2 years now, ever since Robert's health started declining and the medical bills started piling up. Eleanor's been robbing Peter to pay Paul, moving money around like she's playing 3-card Monte. The information aligned perfectly with what Clarisse had discovered, but hearing it confirmed by someone inside the house made it feel more real and more tragic. She's terrified, Grace continued. Terrified of losing that house, terrified of people finding out they're broke, terrified of admitting they need help. Fear makes people do ugly things. That doesn't excuse how they've treated Clarisse, Marcus said, his loyalty evident. No, it doesn't, Grace agreed firmly. What they did at that wedding was shameful. But honey, she looked directly at Clarisse. Revenge is a poison that kills the one who drinks it first. Clarisse felt heat rise in her cheeks. How did you... I've been around powerful people long enough to recognize the look, Grace said gently. You've got options they don't know about, don't you? The question hung in the air. Clarisse found herself unable to lie to this woman who had shown her nothing but kindness in a house full of cruelty. Maybe, she said finally. Grace nodded slowly. I figured. You carry yourself different than they think. Always have. She paused, collecting her thoughts. Can I tell you something about Eleanor? Something most people don't know? Clarisse waited. She married into that name. Her daddy was a plumber in Southie. She spent 40 years terrified that people would find out she didn't belong either. The revelation hit Clarisse like cold water. Eleanor, imperious, condescending Eleanor, was another outsider who had married into wealth and spent decades proving she belonged. That doesn't make what she did okay, Grace continued, but it might help you understand why she did it. Sometimes hurt people hurt people. Marcus was watching Clarisse's face carefully, seeing the conflict playing out in her expressions. What are you saying, Grace? I'm saying that power is a responsibility. Whether it's the power of money or the power of forgiveness. Grace began gathering her bags. You've got a choice to make, honey. You can use what you have to tear them down, or you can use it to build something better. After Grace left, Clarisse and Marcus sat in silence for several minutes. The diner continued its familiar rhythm around them, but something fundamental had shifted in Clarisse's thinking. She's right, Marcus said finally. About what? About revenge being poison. About you having a choice. He studied her face. The question is, what kind of person do you want to be when this is over? Clarisse stared into her coffee, seeing her distorted reflection in the dark surface. She thought about the 7-year-old girl in foster care, watching other kids get chosen while she remained invisible. She thought about working 3 jobs to put herself through college. She thought about building an empire in secret, one deal at a time. All of it had been about proving she was worth something. But what if the real test wasn't proving her worth to people like Eleanor and Victoria? What if it was proving it to herself? I need time to think, she said finally. Marcus nodded. Just remember, once you make this move, there's no taking it back. Whatever you decide, make sure you can live with it. As they left the diner, Clarisse felt the weight of the decision pressing down on her. She had the power to destroy the family that had humiliated her, or she could find another way. The foster kid who had learned to fight for everything was about to discover whether she had also learned when not to fight. The choice would define not just her future with James, but who she would become as a person. And for the first time since her wedding day, Clarisse wasn't sure which path led to victory. The choice would define not just her future with James, but who she would become as a person. And for the first time since her wedding day, Clarisse wasn't sure which path led to victory. The Ashford mansion on Beacon Hill had always intimidated Clarisse, but now she saw it through different eyes. The Georgian facade, with its perfectly maintained brick and gleaming black shutters, represented $5. $6 million in debt disguised as prosperity. As she and James climbed the familiar stone steps that Sunday evening, she knew the market value of every architectural detail. Mother insisted on the family dinner, James said, adjusting his tie nervously. She says it's important to maintain traditions, especially now that we're married. Clarisse said nothing, but her mind calculated the monthly carrying costs of the house, mortgage payments, taxes, insurance, maintenance. The Ashfords were hemorrhaging money to maintain this symbol of their status. Grace answered the door, her expression carefully neutral as she took their coats. They're in the dining room, she murmured to Clarisse, then added quietly, Be careful tonight, honey. Mrs. Ashford's been difficult today. The dining room showcased Eleanor's impeccable taste and her financial desperation. The antique mahogany table could seat 12, surrounded by chairs that probably cost more than most people's cars. But Clarisse noticed details others missed. The faded spot on the wallpaper where a painting had hung, the subtle discoloration suggesting valuable art had been sold. The crystal chandelier was magnificent, but one of the side pieces was missing, likely pawned and never redeemed. Clarisse, how lovely! Eleanor's voice carried its usual Arctic politeness as she air-kissed her daughter-in-law's cheek. You look refreshed. Victoria rose from her seat with theatrical enthusiasm. James! And the bride! How was the honeymoon? I assume you stayed somewhere appropriately. Modest? The barb hit its mark, but Clarisse simply smiled. Martha's Vineyard was beautiful. Very peaceful. Oh, how nice! The vineyard can be so accessible in the off-season. Robert Sr. looked up from his soup with momentary confusion, his eyes focusing on Clarisse with effort. You're the new girl, he said, his voice carrying a clarity that made Eleanor stiffen. The one with the business sense. Father, please eat your soup, Eleanor said quickly, but Robert continued studying Clarisse. "Smart eyes," he murmured. "Haven't seen eyes like that since I was wheeling and dealing. You remind me of myself at your age. Hungry, calculating, ready to take what you want." "Dad," James intervened gently. "Clarisse works at Murphy's Diner. She's not in business." Robert's laugh was sharp and knowing. "If you say so, son." As Grace served the main course, beef tenderloin that probably cost more than some people's weekly grocery budget, Eleanor launched into her familiar territory. "Clarisse, dear, we really must discuss your situation." "My situation?" "Well, now that you're part of the family, there are certain expectations, standards to maintain." Eleanor's smile was razor-thin. "We simply can't have family members working in, well, service positions. It reflects on all of us." Victoria nodded enthusiastically. "Exactly. What will people think when they see James Ashford's wife serving them coffee?" "It's embarrassing." Clarisse felt the familiar heat of humiliation rising, but underneath it was something new, a cold certainty that came from knowing exactly how much power she held in this room. "I see," she said calmly. "And what would you suggest I do instead?" "Perhaps some volunteer work," Eleanor suggested. "Something appropriate for a woman of your background. The hospital auxiliary is always looking for help with filing." "Filing?" Clarisse repeated. "Or maybe the children's literacy program," Victoria added with false enthusiasm. "You could read to underprivileged children. You'd relate to them so well." The condescension was so thick it was almost tangible. James shifted uncomfortably but remained silent, his pattern of avoiding confrontation intact. "You know," Robert Sr. said suddenly, his voice cutting through the tension, "we're drowning." Eleanor's fork clattered against her plate. "Father, please." "Drowning in debt," Robert continued, his moment of clarity devastating in its accuracy. "House mortgage to hell, bills piling up, creditors calling, and here we sit, pretending we're still royalty." "Dad, that's enough," James said sharply, but Robert was unstoppable. Smart thing would be to sell this white elephant, move somewhere modest, live within our means. But Eleanor would rather die than admit we're broke. "Robert, stop!" Eleanor's composure cracked completely. "You don't know what you're saying." "I know exactly what I'm saying," Robert replied, his eyes finding Clarisse's. "Question is, does she?" The silence that followed was deafening. Victoria stared at her grandfather in horror, while Eleanor gripped her napkin so tightly her knuckles were white. James looked between his parents, confusion and dawning realization warring in his expression. Clarisse felt a strange calm descend over her. This was the moment she'd been unconsciously waiting for, the moment when the family's careful facade finally cracked. "Perhaps," she said quietly, "we should discuss practical solutions." "Solutions?" Eleanor's voice was strangled. "Robert is right. The house is beautiful, but it's also a financial burden. There are ways to restructure debt, to create manageable payment plans." "How dare you!" Victoria exploded, her carefully maintained composure finally shattering. "How dare you sit at our table and pretend to understand our situation? You're a waitress. You know nothing about real estate or finance or—" "Actually," Clarisse interrupted, her voice steady as steel, "I know quite a bit about both." Something in her tone made everyone freeze. Even Robert Sr. leaned forward, his sharp businessman's instincts recognizing a shift in the room's dynamics. "You see," Clarisse continued, reaching into her purse and withdrawing a folded document, "I've been doing some research about property values, mortgage structures, debt-to-equity ratios. It's fascinating what you can learn when you know where to look." She unfolded the paper, a property assessment report on the Beacon Hill mansion, and placed it on the table. Eleanor's face went paper white as she recognized the document. "This house is worth approximately $6. $8 million, Clarisse said conversationally. "But you owe $5. $6 million against it. That's not a comfortable margin, especially when you're 3 months behind on payments." Victoria's mouth opened and closed like a fish. "How did you?" "Public records," Clarisse replied. "Amazing what's available when you know how to look. For instance, did you know that your Nantucket property is also in arrears?" The mortgage holder has been surprisingly patient, but that patience won't last forever. Eleanor found her voice, though it shook with rage and fear. You have no right to pry into our private affairs. Actually, Clarisse smiled for the first time all evening. I have every right, because as of Friday afternoon I own both mortgages. The words hung in the air like a bomb waiting to explode. Victoria made a choking sound. Eleanor's face went from white to gray. James stared at his wife as if seeing her for the first time. Robert Sr. began to laugh, a rich, delighted sound that filled the suddenly silent dining room. Well, I'll be damned, he said, his eyes twinkling with what might have been pride. She's been playing chess while you've all been playing checkers. Well, I'll be damned, he said, his eyes twinkling with what might have been pride. She's been playing chess while you've all been playing checkers. The explosion came in stages, Victoria's shocked gasp, Eleanor's strangled cry of, "Impossible!" James's whispered, "What the hell, Clarisse?" But it was the sound of Eleanor's chair scraping against the hardwood as she shot to her feet that broke the tableau. "You're lying!" Eleanor's voice shook with desperate fury. "This is some sick joke." Evans Capital Holdings, Clarisse said quietly, pulling out her phone and scrolling to the mortgage documents. "Ring a bell? Your payments for the last 3 months have been deposited into account number 4471882966634. My account." Victoria made a sound like a wounded animal. That's impossible. You're a waitress. You serve coffee for tips?" "I do serve coffee," Clarisse agreed. "It's excellent cover for conducting real estate transactions. People tell you things when they think you're invisible." James stared at her, as if she'd grown a second head. "Clarisse, what are you talking about? You don't have that kind of money. We share a bank account." "We share one bank account," she corrected gently. "I have several others." Eleanor gripped the back of her chair, her knuckles white. "This is blackmail. This is business," Robert Sr. interrupted, his voice carrying an authority that reminded everyone he'd once commanded respect in Boston's financial circles. "Smart business, if I'm reading this right." He looked at Clarisse with newfound respect. "How long have you been building your portfolio?" 5 years, Clarisse answered, keeping her eyes on James's stunned face. "Since I was 23. "Impossible," Victoria repeated, but her voice had lost its venom, replaced by something closer to panic. "You can't have that kind of money. You lived in that awful apartment. You worked those horrible jobs." "I lived modestly and worked hard because that's how you build capital," Clarisse explained patiently. "Every dollar I didn't spend on keeping up appearances went into real estate investments. While you were buying designer handbags, I was buying buildings." The silence stretched taut as the implications sank in. Grace appeared in the doorway, took one look at the frozen tableau, and quietly began clearing plates with practiced efficiency. James found his voice first. "Why didn't you tell me?" The question carried such hurt that Clarisse felt something twist in her chest. "Would you have believed me? More importantly, would your family have treated me differently if they knew I had money?" Eleanor's laugh was bitter and sharp. "So this was all a test? Some elaborate scheme to—" "No," Clarisse interrupted, her voice gaining steel. "This was survival. I learned a long time ago that people like you only respect power they can see. Well, now you can see it." Victoria had been uncharacteristically quiet, but now she spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. "How much? How much do we owe you?" "The Nantucket property carries a mortgage of $1, $8 million. This house—" Clarisse consulted her phone again. "As of Friday, I hold the primary mortgage of $4, $2 million, plus the second mortgage of $800,000, and I've arranged to assume the home equity line of credit. In total, you owe Evans Capital Holdings approximately $6, $8 million. Eleanor sank back into her chair as if her strings had been cut. "You own everything." "I own the paper on everything," Clarisse corrected. "There's a difference. But yes, if you default, I have the legal right to foreclose. You wouldn't, James said, his voice hollow. You couldn't do that to my family. Clarisse turned to face her husband fully. 2 weeks ago, your family humiliated me at our wedding. Your mother called my life story earnest, like it was something shameful. Your sister mimed falling asleep while I talked about growing up in foster care, and you sat there and let it happen. I was trying to keep the peace. You were being a coward, she said, the words cutting through the room like a blade. And now you're asking me to show mercy to people who've shown me none. Robert Sr. leaned back in his chair, a slow smile spreading across his weathered features. Eleanor, do you remember what I told you when James first brought this young lady home? Eleanor's voice was barely audible. You said she reminded you of yourself. Hungry. Determined. Willing to do whatever it takes to win. Robert's eyes found Clarisse's. I was right, wasn't I? You were, Clarisse acknowledged. The question now is what happens next. Victoria found her voice again, though it shook. What do you want? Money? Some kind of apology? What's your price? The question hung in the air, heavy with implications. Clarisse looked around the dining room, at the antique furniture that represented generations of Ashford legacy, at the oil paintings of long-dead ancestors who had built their fortune through determination not unlike her own, at the family who had dismissed her as worthless. I want, she said slowly, to finish my dinner in peace, without snide comments about my background, without condescending suggestions about appropriate work for someone of my station, and without anyone pretending that I don't belong in this room. Eleanor's mouth opened, then closed. Victoria stared at her plate as if it might provide answers. Is that all? James asked, confusion evident in his voice. For tonight, Clarisse replied. Tomorrow we'll discuss the terms of your debt restructuring. I'm not unreasonable. I'm a businesswoman. But I won't be disrespected in my own home. Your home? Eleanor gasped. My mortgage, Clarisse corrected, which means I have a vested interest in maintaining the property value. But make no mistake, this dynamic changes now. The woman you've been treating as hired help is now your landlord. Grace, who had been quietly observing from the doorway, stepped forward with fresh wine glasses. Perhaps, she said diplomatically, we could all use a fresh start. Robert Sr. raised his water glass. To fresh starts, he said, his voice carrying genuine amusement. And to young women who refuse to know their place. The toast hung in the air, unjoined by anyone else at the table. But Clarisse raised her own glass anyway, meeting the old man's eyes with steady confidence. The toast hung in the air, unjoined by anyone else at the table. But Clarisse raised her own glass anyway, meeting the old man's eyes with steady confidence. The silence that followed dinner was deafening. Eleanor had excused herself before dessert, claiming a sudden headache, though everyone understood it was shock that sent her fleeing to her bedroom. Victoria sat frozen at the table, staring at her untouched crème brûlée as if it might reveal some escape from the nightmare her life had become. James walked Clarisse to their car in complete silence, his movements mechanical and strange. Only when they were seated in his sedan, the mansion's windows glowing behind them like watchful eyes, did he finally speak. Who are you? The question came out broken, barely above a whisper. Clarisse studied her husband's profile in the dim glow of the dashboard lights, seeing a man whose entire understanding of his world had just crumbled. I'm the same person I was this morning, she said quietly. The same person who married you. The same person who's been sharing your bed for 8 months. No. James shook his head, his hands gripping the steering wheel, though the car remained parked. The person I married was a waitress who lived in a studio apartment and worried about student loans. The person I married needed me. The words cut deeper than Clarisse had expected. And if I don't need you, I can't love you? Did you love me? The question came out raw with pain. Or was this all some elaborate con game? Clarisse felt something crack inside her chest. James, I loved you enough to share the most vulnerable parts of myself with your family. I loved you enough to stand at that altar and promise to build a life together. The fact that I didn't tell you about my business doesn't change that. Doesn't change that? James's voice rose. Clarisse, you own my family's house. You've been lying to me for months. I've been protecting myself, she interrupted, her own voice gaining heat. I learned a long time ago that money changes how people see you. Some people only love you when they think you need them. Others only respect you when they think you can't hurt them. So which am I? The question hung between them like a challenge. Clarisse looked at the man she'd married, seeing him clearly for perhaps the first time. James, who had fallen in love with the waitress but couldn't defend her to his family. James, who had been charmed by her vulnerability but struggled with her strength. I don't know, she admitted. That's what I'm trying to figure out. James started the engine and they drove home in silence. Their apartment, modest by Ashford standards but carefully chosen by Clarisse for its proximity to her real office, felt smaller somehow when they walked through the door. I need a drink, James said, heading for the kitchen. Do you want? He stopped mid-sentence, staring at the bottle of wine in his hand. Is this even real? This life we've been living? This apartment, our dinners together, the way you worried about the grocery budget? Was any of it real? Clarisse watched him pour whiskey with shaking hands. The grocery budget was real. I've always been careful with money. That's how I had money to invest. The dinners were real. My feelings for you were real. But you were studying us, James said, not meeting her eyes. Gathering information about my family's finances while you sat at their table. While you sat at our table. I was trying to understand why people who had so much were so cruel to someone they thought had so little. James laughed, but there was no humor in it. And now you have your answer. We're not cruel. We're desperate. We're drowning, and we've been taking it out on anyone who looked like they might be swimming. The honesty in his voice surprised her. For the first time since their wedding, James was seeing his family clearly. What happens now? He asked, finally meeting her eyes. Do you destroy us? Is that what this was all leading to? Clarisse moved to the window, looking out at the Boston skyline where lights twinkled in office buildings and apartments. Somewhere out there were 12 properties she owned, tenants who paid her rent, a business empire she'd built from nothing. And here in this room was a man she'd thought she knew, asking if she planned to destroy his family. 3 days ago, she said slowly, I would have said yes. I wanted to watch your mother's face when she realized the nobody from foster care held the keys to everything she valued. And now? Clarisse thought about Grace's words in the diner, about Eleanor's terrified face at dinner, about Robert Sr., less unexpected pride in her accomplishment, about the fact that revenge, when it finally came, felt less satisfying than she'd imagined. Now I'm thinking about what kind of person I want to be when this is over. James joined her at the window, standing close enough that she could smell his cologne but far enough away that she felt the distance between them like a physical thing. I failed you, he said quietly. At the wedding, at dinner tonight. I've been failing you since the day I brought you home. I was so worried about keeping peace that I let them treat you like you were less than human. Yes, Clarisse agreed. You did. Can you forgive me? The question was simple, but the answer was complex. Clarisse looked at James, really looked at him, and saw not the weak man who'd disappointed her, but someone trying to grow beyond the limitations of his upbringing. I don't know, she said honestly, but I'm willing to try if you are. James nodded slowly. What do we do about my family? We help them, Clarisse said, the words surprising her even as she spoke them. But on different terms. I'm not the desperate waitress anymore, James. I'm not going to beg for their acceptance, or pretend to be less than I am. If they want to be part of my life, our life, they need to earn it. And if they don't? Clarisse's reflection in the window showed a woman who had finally stepped fully into her power. Then they'll discover that the foster kid they dismissed knows exactly how to take care of herself. Outside, Boston glittered with possibility and threat in equal measure. Inside, two people who thought they knew each other were learning that love was more complicated than either money or need, and that sometimes the most important revelations came not from what you gained, but from what you were willing to give up. Outside, Boston glittered with possibility and threat in equal measure. Inside, two people who thought they knew each other were learning that love was more complicated than either money or need, and that sometimes the most important revelations came not from what you gained, but from what you were willing to give up. 4 days after the dinner explosion, James moved his clothes to the guest bedroom. He claimed he needed space to think, but Clarisse recognized the look in his eyes, the same bewildered shock she'd seen in Sellers when they realized they'd been outmaneuvered in a negotiation. The man who thought he'd married down was struggling to accept that he might have married up. Clarisse tried to focus on work, but even her waitressing shifts at Murphy's Diner felt surreal now. She served coffee to construction workers and accountants, while her phone buzzed with updates from Marcus about million-dollar property deals. The double life that had once felt natural now seemed almost absurd. "You're distracted," Marcus observed during their Tuesday morning meeting at the diner. "More distracted than I've seen you since you started this whole thing." "Everything's changed," Clarisse admitted, stirring sugar into coffee she didn't want. "James barely looks at me. Eleanor's been calling the house 20 times a day, but hanging up when I answer. Victoria left 3 voicemails yesterday, one threatening to sue me, one begging me not to foreclose, and one offering to... I think she was trying to bribe me." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "What kind of bribe?" "She said she'd publicly apologize for her behavior and recommend me for membership at the country club." Clarisse's laugh was hollow. "She still doesn't understand that I don't want to join their world. I just want to be respected in my own." "And James?" Clarisse felt something twist in her chest. "James is trying to figure out if he ever really knew me, or if he just fell in love with a fantasy of who he thought I was." Before Marcus could respond, Clarisse's phone rang. The caller ID showed Grace Murphy's name, and Clarisse answered immediately. "Grace, is everything all right?" "Oh, honey." Grace's voice was thick with worry. "Can you come over? To the house? There's been... Well, it's Robert Sr. He's had one of his episodes, but this time he's asking for you specifically." Clarisse exchanged glances with Marcus. "I'll be right there." 20 minutes later, Clarisse stood in the foyer of the Ashford mansion, feeling the weight of its history differently now that she held its financial future in her hands. Grace led her upstairs to Robert Sr.'s study, a masculine room lined with leather-bound books and photographs from his business dealings. Robert sat behind his mahogany desk, looking more alert than Clarisse had seen him in months. When she entered, his eyes focused on her with sharp intelligence. "Ah, the waitress who owns my house," he said with a wry smile. "Sit down, young lady. We need to talk." Grace quietly withdrew, closing the door behind her. Clarisse took the chair across from Robert, noting how the afternoon sunlight highlighted the evidence of his illness, the slight tremor in his hands, the way his attention sometimes drifted before snapping back into focus. "You remind me of myself," he said without preamble. "Not the old fool I've become, but the young man who built this family's fortune. Hungry, ruthless when necessary, willing to take risks others wouldn't consider." "Thank you," Clarisse said, unsure if it was meant as a compliment. "Don't thank me yet. I want to tell you something about this family, something that might change how you proceed." Robert leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "We're not who we pretend to be. Never have been." "What do you mean?" "Eleanor likes to act like she married into old Boston money, but the truth is, I was just as much of an outsider as you are. My father was a construction worker who saved every penny to send me to business school. I built our fortune from nothing, just like you're doing." The revelation shouldn't have surprised her. Grace had hinted at Eleanor's background, but hearing it from Robert himself felt different. "The difference," Robert continued, "is that I let the money change me. I started believing the fiction that wealth made me better than other people. I raised my children to believe it too, and now look what it's produced. A son who can't stand up to his own mother, and a daughter who thinks cruelty is a birthright." "Why are you telling me this?" Robert's eyes grew distant for a moment, then sharpened again. "Because you have a choice to make, and I want you to make it with full information. You can destroy this family. God knows we've given you enough reason. Or you can do what I should have done. use your power to build something better. And what would that look like? It would look like teaching my family that respect isn't something you inherit. It's something you earn. It would look like showing Eleanor that the girl she's been looking down on is exactly the kind of person she used to be. It would look like giving James a chance to become the man he could be, instead of the weak one he's been trained to be. Clarisse studied Robert's weathered face, seeing echoes of her own determination in his faded eyes. What about Victoria? Robert's chuckle was dark. Victoria is the hardest case. She spent 35 years believing her worth comes from her name and her bank account. Learning that both are essentially worthless will either destroy her or force her to find out who she really is underneath all that entitlement. You're asking me to gamble a lot of money on the possibility that your family can change. I'm asking you to gamble on the possibility that people can change. All people, even ones who've hurt you. A soft knock interrupted them. Grace peered in, her expression apologetic. I'm sorry to interrupt, but Eleanor is asking to see you, Miss Clarisse. She's in the garden. Clarisse looked at Robert, who nodded encouragingly. Go talk to her. But remember, you hold all the cards now. Don't let her forget it. The garden behind the mansion was Eleanor's pride, a carefully cultivated space where every flower and shrub was positioned for maximum impact. Clarisse found her sitting on a stone bench beneath a flowering dogwood tree, looking older and more fragile than she ever had before. Thank you for coming, Eleanor said without looking up. Her voice was hoarse, as if she'd been crying. I wasn't sure you would. Grace said you wanted to see me. Eleanor finally raised her eyes, and Clarisse was shocked to see genuine fear there, mixed with something that might have been respect. I wanted to apologize, not because you own my mortgage, although you do, but because I was wrong about you. Completely, utterly wrong. The words hung in the garden air, heavy with the weight of Eleanor's shattered pride. Clarisse remained standing, maintaining the psychological advantage of height. I've spent the last 4 days thinking about what you said at dinner, Eleanor continued, about how we've treated you, about what kind of people we've become, and I realized something terrible. We've become exactly the kind of people we used to hate. What do you mean? Eleanor's laugh was bitter. 25 years ago, when Robert was building his business, there were families just like mine. Old money families who looked down on the new money upstarts. They treated us exactly the way we've been treating you, like we didn't belong, like we weren't good enough for their world. She stood slowly, her movements careful and deliberate. I swore I would never become them. But somewhere along the way I did. I became the very thing I once despised. Clarisse felt something shift inside her chest. Not forgiveness exactly, but something closer to understanding. What are you asking of me, Eleanor? I'm asking for a chance to earn your respect. Not as your debtor, but as your family. I'm asking you to teach us how to be better people than we've been. The request was so unexpected, so fundamentally different from anything Clarisse had imagined, that she found herself speechless. This wasn't the proud, condescending woman who had humiliated her at her wedding. This was someone who had looked into a mirror and finally seen herself clearly. That's a lot to ask, Clarisse said finally. I know, but I'm hoping you'll consider it anyway. Because despite everything, despite all our failures, James loves you. And I hope that you love him too. Standing in the garden where she'd once felt so unwelcome, Clarisse realized that everything had changed again. The simple revenge she'd planned had evolved into something far more complex. The possibility of redemption, for all of them. Standing in the garden where she'd once felt so unwelcome, Clarisse realized that everything had changed again. The simple revenge she'd planned had evolved into something far more complex. The possibility of redemption, for all of them. The call came at 3 a.m. Clarisse jolted awake to her phone, buzzing insistently on the nightstand, James's absence from their bed, a cold reminder of how fractured everything had become. Grace Murphy's name appeared on the screen, and Clarisse's heart immediately began racing. Grace, what's wrong? It's Robert Sr. Grace's voice was tight with worry. He's in the hospital. Heart attack. Eleanor asked me to call you. I'll be right there. Clarisse dressed quickly, her mind spinning with implications she didn't want to consider. She'd grown unexpectedly fond of the old man's sharp wit and honest assessment of his family's flaws. More than that, he'd become an unlikely ally in her complicated relationship with the Ashfords. Massachusetts General Hospital's cardiac unit was a maze of sterile corridors and hushed conversations. Clarisse found the family gathered in a waiting room that probably cost more per night than most people's monthly rent. Even in crisis, the Ashfords maintained their standards. James stood when she entered, his face showing relief mixed with surprise. "I wasn't sure you'd come." "Of course I came." The words came automatically, but as she said them, Clarisse realized they were true. Despite everything, these people had become her family, however dysfunctional. Eleanor sat rigidly in a leather chair, her composure maintained but fragile. Victoria huddled nearby, looking younger and more vulnerable than Clarisse had ever seen her. Both women looked up when Clarisse entered, their faces showing a complex mix of gratitude and uncertainty. "How is he?" Clarisse asked. "Stable," James replied. "The doctors say the next 24 hours are critical, but he's responding well to treatment." They settled into an uncomfortable silence, the weight of recent revelations making normal conversation impossible. Clarisse noticed how the family seemed to orbit around her now, as if her presence had become essential to their functioning. It was Victoria who broke first. "I've been thinking," she said quietly, not meeting anyone's eyes, "about what you said at dinner. About us treating you like you were less than human." Eleanor's head turned sharply toward her daughter, surprise evident in her expression. "I've been cruel," Victoria continued, her voice growing stronger. "Not just to you, but to a lot of people. I told myself it was just how things were, how people like us were supposed to act. But that's not an excuse, is it?" Clarisse studied Victoria's face, looking for signs of manipulation but finding only exhaustion and what appeared to be genuine remorse. "No," Clarisse said quietly. "It's not an excuse." "I don't know how to be different," Victoria admitted. "I've been this person for so long, I'm not sure there's anything else underneath." The vulnerability in Victoria's voice was so unexpected that Clarisse felt something shift in her chest. This wasn't the entitled socialite who had mocked her at the wedding. This was someone confronting the possibility that her entire identity had been built on cruelty and privilege. Eleanor stood abruptly and walked to the window overlooking the city. "We've all been thinking," she said without turning around, "about what kind of people we've become. About what we've done to our family." She paused. "About what we've done to you." James moved closer to Clarisse, not quite touching but close enough that she could feel his warmth. "Dad asked to see you before the surgery," he said softly. "He said there were things he needed to tell you." "What things?" "He wouldn't say. But he made me promise to give you this if—" James's voice broke slightly. "If he didn't make it through." He handed her a sealed envelope with her name written in Robert Sr., nice, shaky handwriting. Clarisse stared at it, feeling the weight of whatever final words the old man had wanted to share. Before she could open it, a doctor in surgical scrubs appeared in the doorway. "Mrs. Ashford, your husband is awake and asking for someone named Clarisse." Eleanor nodded, her composure cracking slightly. "That's his daughter-in-law." The descriptor felt strange but not unwelcome. Clarisse followed the doctor through corridors that smelled of antiseptic and hope, her heart pounding with anticipation and dread. Robert Sr. lay in the cardiac intensive care unit, connected to monitors that beeped with reassuring regularity. Despite the tubes and wires, his eyes were alert and focused when she entered. "There's my favorite real estate mogul," he said, his voice weak but carrying a hint of his familiar humor. "Don't talk too much," Clarisse warned, taking the chair beside his bed. "You need to save your strength." "Strength for what?" "I'm 87 years old and I just had a heart attack. I think we both know how this story ends." Robert's eyes found hers. "The question is how your story continues." "Robert, let me finish," he interrupted gently. "I've been thinking about what I told you in my study, about using your power to build something better. And I realized I was asking you to do something I never had the courage to do myself." Clarisse leaned forward, drawn by the intensity in his fading voice. "I had the money, I had the influence, I had everything I needed to change this family for the better. But I was too proud, too afraid of admitting that the way we'd been living was wrong. Robert's hand found hers, his grip surprisingly strong. You have a chance I never took. A chance to show them that strength doesn't come from putting others down. It comes from lifting them up. What if they don't change? What if this is all just fear talking, and once they feel safe again, they go back to being who they were? Robert's smile was sad, but knowing. Then you'll deal with it. But I don't think that's going to happen. You know why? Clarisse shook her head. Because you've already changed them. Victoria admitted she's been cruel. That's the first honest thing she's said about herself in 20 years. Eleanor asked for your forgiveness instead of demanding it. And James. Robert paused, gathering strength. James is learning that love isn't about protecting someone from the world. It's about standing beside them while they face it. The monitors continued their steady rhythm while Clarisse absorbed his words. You're asking me to take a huge leap of faith. I'm asking you to take the same leap you took when you decided to build a real estate empire while working as a waitress. You've always been good at seeing potential where others see problems. Robert's eyes began to drift closed. The question is whether you can see the potential in this broken family. When Clarisse returned to the waiting room, she found the family exactly as she'd left them, except now James was sitting beside his mother, their hands clasped together in a rare display of connection. How is he? Eleanor asked immediately. Tired, but coherent. He wants all of us to think about what kind of family we want to be going forward. Victoria looked up sharply. What does that mean? Clarisse took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the decision she was about to make. It means I have a proposal for all of you, a way forward that doesn't involve anyone losing their home, but does require everyone to earn their place in this family. The silence was complete, as if the entire waiting room was holding its breath. I'm willing to restructure your mortgages, Clarisse continued. Reasonable payments, fair terms, a chance to rebuild your financial stability. But in exchange, I want changes. Real changes. What kind of changes? Eleanor asked, her voice carefully controlled. Eleanor, you're going to work with me to establish a foundation for foster children. Not just writing checks, but actual work, using your social connections to create opportunities for kids who grew up like I did. Eleanor nodded slowly. I think I'd like that. Victoria, you're going to find something meaningful to do with your life. Whether that's going back to school, starting a business, or volunteering for a cause you care about. But no more sitting around feeling sorry for yourself while treating other people badly. Victoria's eyes filled with tears, but she nodded. Okay, yes. I want to try. And, James. Clarisse turned to her husband, her heart in her throat. You're going to marriage counseling with me. We're going to learn how to be honest with each other, how to stand up for what we believe in, and how to build something real together. James's relief was visible. Yes. Anything you want. It's not about what I want, Clarisse corrected. It's about what we build together. All of us. She looked around the waiting room at these flawed, complicated people who had hurt her and whom she now had the power to help or destroy. This isn't charity. And it's not revenge. It's investment. I'm investing in the possibility that people can change, that families can heal, and that love can survive even the biggest mistakes. Eleanor stood and crossed to where Clarisse sat. For a moment, the two women looked at each other. The foster kid turned real estate mogul, and the plumber's daughter turned society matron, and saw themselves reflected in each other's struggles. Thank you, Eleanor said simply, for seeing something in us worth saving. Don't thank me yet, Clarisse replied. Thank me in a year when we see if any of this actually works. But as she looked around at the faces surrounding her, James's hopeful expression, Victoria's tentative smile, Eleanor's newfound humility, Clarisse felt something she hadn't expected: hope. Not for revenge or dominance, but for the harder, more valuable prize of genuine family. Outside the hospital windows, Boston continued its restless life, but inside the cardiac unit's waiting room, a new kind of family was being born. One built not on tradition or obligation, but on choice, forgiveness, and the radical idea that people could change if someone believed in them enough to give them the chance. The foster kid who had learned to fight for everything was about to discover whether she had also learned when fighting wasn't the answer. Whether the most powerful thing she could do with her wealth wasn't to destroy her enemies, but to transform them into allies. Whether love, in the end, was stronger than both money and pride. Whether love, in the end, was stronger than both money and pride. 6 months later, Clarisse stood in the renovated conference room of the Evans Ashford Foundation, watching Eleanor conduct a board meeting with surprising competence. The woman who had once dismissed her as earnest now spoke passionately about providing college scholarships for foster children aging out of the system. "We've placed 37 kids in paid internships this quarter," Eleanor reported to the assembled board members, her voice carrying genuine pride. "And Clarisse's mentorship program has a 90% college enrollment rate." Victoria, seated at Eleanor's right, looked up from her laptop where she'd been tracking donation numbers. The purposelessness that had defined her for years had been replaced by sharp focus as the foundation's development director. "We're also seeing increased corporate partnerships. The tech companies especially want to support our coding bootcamp initiative." Clarisse smiled, remembering the woman who had mimed falling asleep during her wedding speech. That Victoria seemed like a different person entirely, one who had found purpose in helping others rather than judging them. James squeezed her hand under the table. Their marriage counseling sessions had been brutal at first, forcing them to confront how much they hadn't known about each other. But somewhere in those difficult conversations, they'd discovered something stronger than the fantasy they'd initially built their relationship on: genuine partnership. "Before we adjourn," Clarisse said, standing, "I have an announcement. Evans Capital Holdings is donating the Nantucket property to the foundation. We're converting it into a retreat center for foster families." Eleanor's eyes filled with tears, not of loss, but of pride. The summer house that had once symbolized their superiority would now serve children who had grown up as Clarisse had, without family or financial security. After the meeting, the four of them walked together through Boston Common, an unlikely family bound not by blood or tradition, but by choice and second chances. Robert Sr. walked with them in spirit. His recovery had been miraculous, though he now spent most of his time reading to children at the Foundation's community center. "You know what I realized today?" Victoria said, linking arms with Clarisse as they strolled past the public garden. "For the first time in my life, I'm proud of who I am instead of what I inherited." Eleanor nodded thoughtfully. "I keep thinking about that girl I used to be, the plumber's daughter who was so desperate to fit in. I wish I could tell her that belonging isn't something you take from others. It's something you build together." "And I learned," James added, his arm around Clarisse's waist, "that loving someone means seeing them clearly, not protecting them from the truth." Clarisse looked at these people who had once seemed so foreign to her world and realized they had become her world. Not because they'd accepted her into their circle, but because they'd all stepped out of their circles entirely to create something new. The foster kid who had learned to fight for everything had discovered that the greatest victory wasn't defeating your enemies, it was transforming them into family. The waitress who had hidden her success had learned that true power came not from secrets, but from lifting others up. As they walked toward the setting sun, Clarisse pulled out her phone and deleted the contact information for the foreclosure attorney she'd never needed to call. Some weapons, she'd learned, were more powerful when they remained unused. The Ashford name would continue, but its legacy would be measured not in social standing or inherited wealth, but in the lives changed by their foundation. And Clarisse Evans Ashford, no longer hiding behind any facade, would make sure that legacy honored both the girl she'd been and the woman she'd become. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us. Quote,